Good afternoon. I'm Serge Belanger, one of the healthcare analysts here at Needham. Welcome to the 18th annual conference, and we're happy to have the Dermira team here. This is a company I've followed since the very start from the IPO. A lot of highs, some lows, but I think we're back at a very interesting spot in where the company is. So we have Tom Wiggans, the CEO, Andrew Guggenheim, the CFO, and Chris Griffiths, Chief Business and Strategy. So I'll hand it over to Tom to talk about where the company is and some of the new exciting programs that we can talk about.
Well, thank you all for joining us, and for anybody who's on the webcast, thank you. First, I will make a forward-looking statement. As a reminder, we will be making forward-looking statements that may involve risks and uncertainties. So with that disclaimer, I would ask that if you would like more information, you can seek out information in our SEC filings. And with that disclaimer, I guess I will make an introduction and then turn it over to Serge for questions. Thank you all for being here again. We are at an exciting time. We'll be talking today about our Qbrexza launch, which is going very well. And obviously, a couple of weeks ago, we unblinded our lebrikizumab data, and we're very, very thrilled with the data and the potential advance that this product could represent in the treatment of moderate to severe atopic dermatitis, and that potentially very large market over the next couple of years. So we are committed to innovation in medical dermatology. We like where we are with our first two products, and we look forward to discussing the business with you further. Serge?
So let's start with Lebri, since it's so fresh on everybody's mind. If you don't mind going through the data we just saw and what you thought was the most exciting part of it.
Let me start out, and then I'll turn it over to Chris for some more information. I mean, frankly, there was a lot of exciting stuff that we saw, and I'll start with the high level. Obviously, we believed in the inhibition of IL-13 pathway as a potentially very strong, unique way to affect the disease, moderate to severe atopic dermatitis. Certainly, the data suggests that IL-13 is an important pathway in AD, and inhibiting it certainly demonstrated in our trial that the manifestations of skin in the disease were dramatically improved, as well as reduction in pruritus, which is also a very important pathology of atopic dermatitis. So as we reviewed the data and reached out to key opinion leaders and shared the data with them, I think the high-level reaction was great efficacy, particularly on the more difficult endpoints. The IGA score, a percent of patients who achieved 0 or 1 on IGA, the PASI 90 data on efficacy, the lower incidence of conjunctivitis, which we had seen in previous trials, was validated again in this trial, as well as the potential to maybe have less frequent administration. All of those things were very exciting to us. With regard to the PASI 90, I would point out, and we've talked about this since we acquired the product, we saw a lot of development and commercial similarities between the development of biologics for the treatment of atopic dermatitis, as we saw in the development of biologics for the treatment of psoriasis. The market evolution, the development learnings as you develop more products, and certainly as you looked at the development of biologics for psoriasis, PASI 50 was the standard until PASI 75 became the standard, and then PASI 90 became the standard, and even PASI 100. The miracle of being able to essentially eliminate the disease in psoriasis patients. And we were particularly encouraged when we saw the EASI 90 data on lebrikizumab, and very exciting that development pathway and the outcomes that we might be able to offer patients was very exciting to us. So when you say, what do we like most about the data, the bottom line is we liked it all, but certainly some of the tougher endpoints and the pruritus data quality of life improvements, all of those things were very exciting to us. So, Chris, anything to add?
I think that's a good summary. Maybe the only thing, I would add is, when we thought about, what the target product profile looked like for a new treatment for atopic dermatitis, things you would be looking for, very strong safety profile, a good level of efficacy, convenient for the patient to take and easy for the physician to use. We think that Regeneron and Sanofi have set a high bar with their success with dupilumab. Has been a real advance in the treatment of the condition. And, excited that we think we cleared the bar, frankly, on really all of those metrics. Lebrikizumab has a very well-established, safety profile consistent with the IL-13 class. We see efficacy results that are above what we saw with Dupi across almost, all of the measures that we've looked at. From a tolerability standpoint, that's one of the challenges that you see with dupilumab is this high incidence of conjunctivitis. It's a little bit of a challenge for folks to manage. We don't see that in our data, and we think that's a real differentiator. The opportunity for lebrikizumab to offer a extended dosing regimen beyond the Q2-week regimen that is available for dupilumab, we think are real differentiators, and we're excited about that.
I think pre-data, you had kind of talked about the go, no-go criteria based, as you mentioned, efficacy, safety, tolerability, and the dosing regimen. I think you more or less hit on all of them. So as you keep those criteria in front of you and you think of the phase 3 trial, what do you want to accomplish, I guess, in the phase 3 trial across these 4 attributes?
Yeah, that's a great observation. As we had met with some of you before the data, one of our objectives was to try to make the decision on a go, no-go as objective as possible. And we had done a lot of research with physicians, and our commercial team had done a great job of setting up different models and conjoint analysis levers we could toggle based upon the data that we got. And it was very clear from the data that the overwhelming first choice, always a winner, is efficacy. What are the absolute values in these parameters? And that's the most important thing with physicians, healthcare practitioners. Tolerability was also important, and then dosing and administration. So when we set up that decision tree, as it turns out, it was an easy decision. And as we think about going into phase 3, certainly the focus will be on what can we do to make sure that we duplicate the activity we've seen and make efficacy the highest priority. Also looking at tolerability and also looking at dosing flexibility.
Okay. And then just in terms of the safety profile from your market research and your discussions with KOLs, how much of an issue is allergic conjunctivitis with Dupixent?
First of all, I will echo what Chris said. We respect the high bar that Dupi set with regard to safety, and I think that the uptake of that product is a reflection of the market need and also the safety that they've been able to demonstrate in that product. So that's the bar that we felt like we needed to get over. When you talk about conjunctivitis right now, I think it is difficult to manage in a number of patients. What we found from market research, though, is when there's really no alternative, both the physicians and the patients are probably inclined to tolerate it simply because their disease state is getting so much better. They are really happy patients and dermatologists. So we want to make sure that is fully appreciated. I think what we saw from our market research, though, if given an alternative where you did not need or would not see the level of conjunctivitis that's seen with dupilumab, that would be a real advantage. In fact, I had a small group of physicians before the data, and I asked them, if there's one thing you could improve on dupilumab, what would it be? I kind of assumed it would be less frequent dosing, and every one of them said lower conjunctivitis.
Okay. And then in terms of the next steps, I think we're going to see the full data from the phase 2b at a medical meeting at some point, but I think maybe that's the next item we'll see. But what about the Almirall option licensing agreement? Should we get an answer from them? Is that the next catalyst that we should expect?
Well, we're working on a number of things. We are anxious to get the data presented as quickly as possible. We hope that will be in the fall. We are moving as rapidly as we can to set up an end-of-phase 2 meeting to make sure that we agree with the FDA on what the phase 3 program should look like. And as you pointed out, we are obligated to send to Almirall the complete data package. And upon receipt of the data package, they have 45 days to opt in, should they decide to do so. And our current projection is, based upon our delivery to them and their opt-in period, we should probably know around mid-year, late Q2, early Q3 of their decision.
Okay. I'd add just one point of clarification, because we've been asked this question before. Almirall paid us $30 million for the right to have this exclusive period over which they could evaluate the data to make their determination. We received that $30 million in cash in the first quarter. From a revenue standpoint, we actually would expect to recognize that $30 million in the second quarter, when the point at which we would actually deliver the package triggers the recognition of the revenue associated with it. The later payments, which would total $80 million over the relatively near term, should they opt in, that revenue recognition would be determined at a later point. I think our view is we're in a great position regardless of the decision Almirall makes. If they choose to opt in, we get $50 million upon the opt-in, $30 million in connection with the start of the trial, and a good partner with whom we can move forward in phase 3. If they choose not to opt in, we would own worldwide rights, again, in all territories for atopic dermatitis. So we like the position we're in. And I just remind folks that, the U.S. opportunity comprises the overwhelming majority of the global opportunity for AD, and that has been and will continue to be our primary focus.
Okay. Maybe just give us a reminder of what Almirall is responsible for once they trigger the option.
Well, we will collaborate on the global program. Part of the package we will submit to them will be our global registration program. We're responsible for that. They are responsible primarily for the additional studies that they would need to conduct for their market, essentially. So, Chris, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, no, that's right. And then they allow us to be responsible for commercialization, specifically in Europe.
Okay. And if we can talk about the AD market, the atopic dermatitis market, and obviously the U.S. market is growing pretty rapidly with the launch of Dupixent now almost 2 years. How's the market relative in size in Europe?
Well, they were about a year, 15 months after U.S. launch. They launched in Europe. I guess 18 months. Mm-hmm. So, it's a little later, but I think 80 to 85% of their most recently reported sales were in the U.S. Is that right?
Yeah, I think the market research projections that are generally available out there might support the notion that the European total commercial opportunity is expected to be in the range of maybe a third of the size of the U.S. market at the end of the day.
And then you talked about an end-of-phase 2 meeting. Should we expect that around mid-year also?
Yeah, I think we were hoping to get that meeting scheduled mid-year.
Okay. And that puts you on track for a phase 3 trial initiation toward the latter half of 2019?
Correct.
That's right. Yeah, and what we've said is, assuming we start the trial as planned by the end of the year, we would expect it, subject to the final design and size of the trial, but we expect it to be about 15 to 18 months between the initiation of that trial and enrolling the first patients to the top-line data readout for the 16-week primary analysis, which would put us right in the first half of 2021 for the top-line data from the 2 pivotal trials.
And in terms of phase 3 trial design, obviously we'll have to wait till the end of phase 2 meeting, but is there any reason to think we won't see something similar to what Regeneron and Sanofi did with Dupixent?
I don't believe there's any reason to expect that there would be any surprises versus what they did, and in fact, versus what we did in our phase 2 trial.
Okay. And then, I guess just thinking about the overall market, you're coming with a new mechanism of action. There's a number of other kind of similar stage programs that are out there. Want to just discuss some of them, some of the different classes with JAKs. Where do you think things shake out once these things get through development?
Yeah, let me turn it over to Chris and let him kind of describe the way we see this market.
Yeah, I think as we see the competitive landscape in atopic dermatitis, I think a couple things. One is I think there's a tendency for people to describe it as a crowded market. I think we would just observe that there is in fact only one approved systemic therapy in the market today, which is dupilumab. There are a number of approaches in development that we see really falling into three broad categories. The first is the IL-13 class, which we would submit includes products like dupilumab, lebrikizumab, tralokinumab program that we know is ongoing at Leo. And again, against the rubric of what we would see as a profile you would like to produce to have a best-in-disease therapy, that class is pretty well established and validated, I think, with the experience with Dupi and now the data that we have in phase 2. You see very strong safety profile, very high levels of efficacy, convenient administration regimen, and a product that's very easy to use. The label is very clean. It doesn't require monitoring. It doesn't require dosage adjustments and things like that. So a type of thing that dermatologists who are trying to run high volumes of patients through their practice, not deal with a lot of callbacks and a lot of referrals, are prone to use in the first-line position. And again, we believe that in the data that we produce, we have opportunity to be best in that class and therefore best in disease. The other two categories that we see sort of shaping up are, number one, the oral JAK inhibitor space, right? We know there's been a lot of interest in that target amongst many pharma companies who are pursuing a wide range of different indications. And certainly we think, promise in that class, and we should say that there is, we think the market and the diversity of patient needs in atopic dermatitis will ultimately support a number of blockbuster product opportunities. The efficacy data that we've seen in the early phase 2 experience with some of the oral JAK inhibitors has been promising. I think there still remains to be seen whether the safety profile will ultimately, and frankly some of the attendant complexities such as lab monitoring, dosage adjustments, those sorts of things that we have seen historically in the labels of JAK inhibitors have been approved in other indications, and I think are top of mind. And probably the conversations that are ongoing about this next wave of JAK inhibitors from a labeling standpoint are really going to be sufficient to support widespread adoption and utilization in the dermatology specialty that is conscious, very conscious of safety, and very conscious of the logistics of using the product. Again, notwithstanding the oral administration opportunity. I would also observe in that in that class, you definitely see a significant dose response in terms of efficacy, and some of the more impressive numbers that have been reported from an efficacy standpoint are at these higher doses that may or may not be suitable ultimately for administration in general, or in a condition like AD, as you see some of these decisions that are being made in the regulatory filing interactions between the likes of Lilly and AbbVie and so forth. Again, I think remains to be seen there, but we'll see whether those products are really suitable for first-line use. The third category would be more novel targets, where we've seen some promising early proof of concept data in some of these approaches, but we don't have a lot of clinical experience with really any of these other products in the IL-33 or other more novel targets like that to really describe ultimately what the efficacy, and again, very importantly, what the safety profile of these novel approaches will ultimately look like.
Okay. I guess just to stay on the competitive landscape, Leo Pharma also has an IL-13 in development. Just from what you've seen with their data, how do you think Lebri compares?
Well, I'd start by saying it is clearly an IL-13 inhibitor, and that's a path that we're pretty excited about. But I would point out that the data up to this point and the characteristics of the antibody itself would suggest that maybe it might not be as potent of an IL-13 inhibitor as lebrikizumab. So certainly we believe in the pathway. We're rooting for the product, but we would predict that maybe Lebri's got an advantage in terms of efficacy based on characteristics of the antibody and the previous studies that have been reported on both Lebri now and Trello.
And I guess Dupixent has approval for a number of indications, including asthma, and may have a few other ones by the time you get to market. Do you see that as an advantage for that product, or is that going to matter at all, given the product profile you've seen with Lebri?
Yeah, well, it will matter more than not at all. And it's a great product and has been shown to be effective in a number of additional indications. While we don't rule out studying additional indications, our conviction, our commitment right now, as Andrew alluded to, is to be a best-in-disease IL-13. When we talk to dermatologists about their thinking of a product for AD, by and large, their view is, I want the best product for my AD patients, and our goal is to provide that to them.
I think, I would add, and Chris, you can chime in, you think about where might that be relevant. First you look from a payer standpoint, what are they looking for? They're looking for, frankly, new additional treatments for the condition. They're going to look at the clinical profile. We believe that Lebri has a chance to be best in disease. So I think we believe Lebri, even if initially approved only in AD, can be very competitive from a payer standpoint when it comes to access. And from a physician standpoint, AD is prescribed primarily by dermatologists. They're looking for, the best product to treat their patients. Some has been made of, well, what about those AD patients who suffer from moderate to severe disease that also have moderate to severe asthma? That's a pretty small overlap. You're looking at somewhere in the mid to high single digits to low teens in terms of percentage of moderate to severe AD patients that also have asthma. So I think from a physician standpoint, we don't believe there's a disadvantage of having the best in disease treatment for the specific condition, atopic dermatitis. And the last thing I would submit, and this maybe applies more to the payer standpoint, in the context of the overall opportunity across multiple potential indications, it is our view that even for Dupi and potentially for Lebri, should we get more, the AD component of that overall opportunity for these IL-4, IL-13 inhibitors is going to comprise the lion's share. That's what will matter most.
I guess before we move on to Qbrexza, anything else from Lebri that we haven't covered?
No. Clearly excited about the data, committed to moving this forward as quickly as possible, and look forward to keeping everybody informed of our progress. And certainly, we'll let everybody know when we get confirmation on when the data are going to be presented for the first time.
Okay. So moving on to Qbrexza, I think we've seen. We're lucky to follow the scripts on a weekly basis, and we've seen some pretty nice growth over the last 3-4 weeks. I think it coincides with an expansion in formulary coverage. Can you just provide an update on where you are with the launch and where you think it's going?
We're very happy with the launch across all components. And I think as we've talked about over the last half year or so, as we prepared for launch and then executed on the launch, our efforts really fell into a couple of buckets. One was creating disease state awareness around hyperhidrosis, because our data suggested by far 70 to 80% of the patients either did not know what they had or had at one point sought treatment and had given up, literally, because there really were no effective treatments. So consumer awareness, disease awareness was certainly an important component. The second important component was access. That's obviously always important in any product launch, but certainly for a small company like us with a first product launch, and in dermatology where the last thing you want a dermatologist to experience and their patients to experience is either a rejection, a callback, no coverage, more hassle, and we put a lot of programs, I'll talk about more in a minute, in place to address those. Then, of course, the third component was the sales force and the direct interaction with HCPs. So all of those things have gone extremely well. The disease state awareness drove over 3 million patients to a website, over 1 million of them filled out a questionnaire. So the patient activation has gone very well. The market access has gone very well. We are over 80% of commercial lives covered, which exceeded our expectations, and I think a great job done by the managed care team to get that. And there are a lot of ingredients into that successful formula. Certainly, early interaction with the payers helped. Getting a label down to 9 years of age clearly helped for a lot of reasons. And then the programs we put in place to assure access clearly helped. I think, as many of you know, we wanted to make sure we had a fail-safe or bailout program as the managed care coverage ramped up, that if you did not have coverage, you could get the product for no more than $70. I think the investment in that program has been strong because there haven't been a lot of callbacks. There haven't been a lot of hassles in getting the product, and that has reinforced the prescribing behavior. As we got over 80% coverage, it was our determination that that program was no longer necessary. It was our determination that the impact that was having on our gross to net calculations doesn't need to occur anymore. I think, as many of you know, we had in Q3 and Q4 we had gross to nets in the 60 to 70% range. For Q1, it will probably stay in that range, in the 70 to 80% range. That was an investment that we chose to make in order to get the kind of access that we needed to have. We don't think we need to do that anymore. So as of April 1st, that $70 bailout program has ended. And I just came from our national sales meeting yesterday, and the sales force is making sure that they will be able to reinforce the coverage that we do have. And I would remind, not only 80% of commercial lives are covered, that is all on Tier 2 or Tier 3. And so those patients, frankly, that we've been subsidizing with a program that had to pay $70 to get the prescription can get it for $25 or $35 now. And that's the program we've got moving forward. It may have short-term implications with regard to demand, but I think we'll see the gross to net get down into the range where we think it ought to be over the next quarter or two.
Okay.
And I think just confirming that, as Tom said, with the changes that went into effect April 1, we may see some temporary downward pressure in scripts, potentially week to week, even month to month. We do think the script levels in Q2 will exceed Q1 and continue to accelerate over the balance of the year. And the revenue per unit will certainly increase in Q2 as the growth to net improves, such that the sales growth in Q2 will exceed that of the script growth because the profitability per unit will improve. As Tom said, we continue to remain confident in the growth to net levels of approximately 40% in the second half of the year based on the changes we're making. Q1, as Tom said, will likely be in the mid to high 70s. We expect that to drop significantly in Q2 and as we go forward. So we're really thrilled with the progress we've made. Being ahead on the coverage standpoint has allowed us to implement these changes to the program earlier than anticipated. We'll get to the right spot from the GTN standpoint beginning in Q2 and certainly into the second half of the year.
So I would just add one other thing. It's early in the launch, no doubt. We know we have to build a market. We have to create a market, no doubt. But we're very excited with where we are on all of the parameters that we're measuring. The last thing I would point out, if you haven't seen it, because of the managed care coverage and because of the adoption by physicians and the feedback physicians are getting from the patients that they come in, we triggered 2 weeks ago the transition from a disease awareness campaign to a product-specific direct-to-consumer campaign. So if you haven't seen it, hopefully you will. That just started. We expect that will drive demand in the coming months and quarters. And we've gotten anecdotal reports already of patients calling physician's office saying, I saw it, I want to come in and get it. That's what we hope happens. But as I say, it's early days in the launch, but we're very excited about all of the progress that we're making.
So is formulary coverage right now forcing patients to step through other treatments like Drysol or Botox? Or?
You know, we've been very fortunate that there isn't a lot of PAs, and it's all PA to label. So some patients may have needed to fail on Drysol, but by and large, it's a very simple PA to fill out if you have to fill out a PA. Yeah. And I would encourage everybody to do that because it's not that hard.
Any anecdotal feedback in terms of efficacy and safety? Often we see products used in the real world act better than they did in clinical trials.
Actually, we have, and you know, in all of my experiences in launching dermatology products, if you go out early on and you go out in the first couple of weeks or a month or two and ask the dermatologist, so how's it going? They will almost invariably say, I don't know yet. I've written a couple of prescriptions. I want to hear back from my patients on what they think. And I think what you see in the market as the momentum builds is those initial patients coming back and telling their dermatologist, I really like this. It's really working for me. So I think what we've heard anecdotally from the real world is it works quickly. You know, the first data point we measured in our clinical trials was 1 week, and we saw activity at 1 week. We're hearing from the field. Some patients are seeing a benefit in a couple of days, which is fantastic. And the product is very tolerable. So we know there can be anticholinergic side effects, dry mouth in some cases, blurred vision temporarily. So there are anticholinergic effects, but those are very rare and very well tolerated. So yeah, I think the bottom line, as you said, it seems like the real world experience is as good as or better than we saw in the clinical trials.
Okay. And then obviously you're building a market share right now. Where do you think that share is coming from? Is it from other products or just new patients to the market?
It is as we predicted it would be, and we knew it should be. If we're going to build this market to where we think it ought to be, that is not taking share from Botox and Drysol. And we've been very encouraged by the high percent of prescriptions written for patients that are new to therapy, which means they weren't on something else before. Now, we certainly are getting information on switches from other products, but you know, those are hundreds of thousands of patients being treated by the other products. We'd prefer to address the millions of patients who haven't been on therapy, and we can drive them into the physician's office and have them put on Qbrexza.
So the product's only been available for 2 quarters now, but are you starting to get a handle on what the refill prescription rate is?
I think it's too early to tell what the refill rate is. However, I would say it's trending in the direction that we assumed it would be. Many of you know our forecasts are based on 3 prescriptions per year per patient. And that's an average of some patients getting more, obviously, and some patients getting 1 and never getting it refilled. But I think it's trending towards our projections. It'd be great to exceed 3 prescriptions a year, but we'll have to wait and see.
Okay. And then label expansion work is already underway. The Palmer trial. Talk about, I guess, market opportunity.
I think it's clearly a function of market opportunity, but it's also clearly a function of understanding the activity in Palmer, because we get that question all the time, right? It's probably the first question in 100% of the calls on dermatologists. Well, what about areas other than the axillary? And the answer is we don't know. And the Palmer skin is different than axillary skin. So from a penetration standpoint, we've done some preliminary work to understand that. From a retention time on the hands, how long do you need to leave it on to get a benefit? So we're studying those things right now in the pilot study. So we think we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to the patients, we owe it to the market to understand the potential application in Palmer, and then we'll go from there.
I guess we only have a few minutes left here. Andrew, if you wouldn't mind walking us through the financials and I guess the recent cash balances and transactions.
Sure, yeah. Certainly we've done a lot over the last 6 months to really further solidify the financial position of the company. We had $316 million as of year-end 2018 on the balance sheet. I mentioned earlier we received $30 million from the Almirall option agreement in the first quarter. And then on the heels of the positive leverage data, we completed and closed an equity financing under which we received net proceeds of about $140. So you've got the $316 plus the $30 plus $140. We still have an additional $90 million available to us under our structured financing facility. And also, as mentioned earlier, should Almirall choose to exercise its option for rights to Europe, we would receive another $80 million in the next few quarters under that agreement. So we've done a lot to bolster our financial position. And frankly, whether we access the additional amounts of the structured financing facility or alternatively Almirall exercises its option, we're fully funded through the top-line data for the leverage phase 3 program in the first half of 2021.
Well, I think we'll end there. Thank you all for answering my questions.
Sir, thanks for having us.
Appreciate having
thanks
you
to all of you for being here, and thanks to all of you who are listening on the webcast.